The Taliban have been rolling back rights for women since retaking power in 2021. In particular, limiting access to education and social outings and events for women. In October, they announced new restrictions forbidding women from reciting prayers in the same room, essentially banning them from attending mosques. This comes after already banning girls from attending school after grade 6. Earlier, I spoke to Richard Bennett. He's the UN Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan about the situation for women and girls and what he would like to see from Canada. UN Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your program, Rosemary.
There is a lot happening in Afghanistan right now, and I know you have a lot of concerns. So I'll get to, I guess, what to me seems to be one of the biggest concerns, at least for people in this country, and that is the Taliban rolling back rights for women and girls. Everything from education to not being allowed to hear other women speak in public. How would you describe the situation for women in Afghanistan right now?
Well, I'm certainly glad that it's of concern to Canadians, because I think this is not getting sufficient attention around the world. It is, in fact, I think, appalling, indeed atrocious, that women especially are basically erased from society, unable to get an education beyond 6th grade. That's the only country in the world where that's the case. Severe restrictions on movement, on employment, on freedom of expression, as you just said, and basically consigned to their homes much of the time. This surely should appall Canadians, grab their attention, and demand that the government does even more. The Canadian government, in fact, has been relatively strong on opposing these issues, but I think the people of Canada really need to know exactly what's going on in Afghanistan these days.
And I'm going to get to some of the things you're calling for Canada to do, but I did want to ask you, because in some of the things that you've written about, you also talk about the effect on Afghan men of women not being present in the world outside of the home. And I wonder if you can just explain what you mean by that as well.
Well, it's a really abnormal situation, but I've used the word normalization in different senses. And one of them is that if boys grow up with no strong female role models, and the kind of ideology to which they're being exposed, what kind of men are they going to grow into? Mm-hmm. I spoke to an Afghan woman, it was in one of my reports, who said that these days she feels that she is surveilled by her son, and compared to the past, who questions whether she should be going out or from the house, and if she does, what she should be wearing, and why she should be moving out of the home at all.
You were in Canada just last month, and you called at the time for Ottawa to offer refugee status to all Afghan women and girls seeking asylum. What kind of response have you had to that request, Mr. Bennett?
I think there's been interest. This is consistent with what is already happening in Europe. Some Scandinavian countries announced a policy along these lines more than a year ago. And recently there was a European court decision based on an Austrian case where the judgment is really that all Afghan women and girls are considered to be persecuted and therefore are entitled to refugee status. I was merely introducing what is happening in Europe already for Canada's consideration, especially as Canada has a feminist foreign policy.
You, as a part of your job, you have to engage with the Taliban, and I know that they were at the most recent sort of summit on I don't know if it was just on Afghanistan, but in Doha, they came to the table with limitations in terms of what they would talk about. But I wonder how important is it to engage with the Taliban on these issues? Is that the way to do this?
I'm very much in favor of engagement. It's always useful to have dialogue, but also to be very clear about the conditions or the benchmarks for that discussion in terms of moving forward. And those must include respect for human rights, and in this case, respect for the rights and dignity of women and girls. I realize this may be a step-by-step process, or perhaps as the UN calls it, a step-4-step process. But it can't be the elephant in the room. It must be something that is insisted on by all who are committed to universal human rights standards.
As you know, Mr. Bennett, Canadian soldiers left Afghanistan 10 years ago this past spring. That mission was very difficult. 158 soldiers died. And many Canadians look now at what has happened in Afghanistan and feel very disappointed. What would you say to Canadians who feel that way? And what more does this country need to do to help a country that we became quite attached to?
It's going to be very difficult to turn back the clock. And I feel for the families of those 158 Canadian military, and I think a couple of diplomats too, yes, who lost their lives. I think what can be done now is at least, and we've mentioned it already in this conversation, providing some protection for those Afghans who are most at risk because they associated not only with Canadians, but with the values that Canada also espouses. And also the majority of Afghans still remain in the country. There's still 35 million inside the country. Not all of them can leave or even want to leave. And many are continuing their lives, doing their best to earn a living, to feed their families, and they need support. And I mean, not only humanitarian support. I agree that humanitarian support needs to be continued by Canada and others, but also political, moral support and funding support for organizations that are standing up for human rights. Those are a couple of areas. I think also Canada has, in light of its feminist foreign policy, initiated with 3 other countries a dispute with the state of Afghanistan under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I think this is a positive move because there is no accountability. There is a climate of impunity. And this dispute may end up in the International Court of Justice. Many Afghans are calling for justice or some form of accountability for what they are being subjected to. And in this case, this is claimed to be a violation of an international treaty that Afghanistan ratified and which protects the rights of women and girls.
Richard Bennett, thank you so much for your time, for speaking with us. Thank you.